The night Theresa Reed collapsed off her horse in front of Jedediah Vaughn's barn, the snow was falling so thick and fast that a man could barely see his own hand stretched before him, and Jedediah had not spoken a word to God in 12 years. He heard the thud before he saw her. He had been inside the barn, pitching fresh hay into the stall where his aging roan gelding, Copper, stood watching him with patient brown eyes. The wind off the Montana plains had been screaming all evening, rattling the barn doors on their iron hinges, sending little rivers of snow curling under the wooden frame and spreading across the dirt floor. January of 1883 was proving to be the cruelest winter the territory had seen in a generation, and Jedediah had already lost 2 of his cattle to the cold. He was not in a charitable mood, and he had not been in a charitable mood for quite some time. But that sound, that dull, final, human sound of a body meeting frozen earth, cut right through the howling wind and right through the thick bark of indifference he had built around himself over the years, and he dropped his pitchfork without a second thought. He threw open the barn door, and the snow hit him full in the face, stinging his cheeks, blinding him for a moment. He raised his forearm against it and stepped out into the dark. The lantern he had left hanging just inside the barn threw a small, trembling circle of amber light out into the yard, and within that circle he saw her. She was lying face down in the snow. A dark horse, a dappled gray, which he did not recognize, stood a few feet away, reins dangling, steam rising from its heaving flanks. The animal looked half dead with exhaustion. The woman looked worse. Jedediah crossed the yard in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside her. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck and felt a pulse thin and fast, like a bird's heartbeat, and then he rolled her carefully onto her back. Even in the poor light he could see she was young, probably not far past 20, and her face was paper-white except for 2 fever-bright spots of red high on her cheekbones. Her lips were cracked and dry, which told him the fever had been burning for some time, long before the cold had gotten to her. She was wearing a coat that was decent enough for the season but was soaked through at the shoulders, and her boots were good but not good enough for a ride like whatever ride she had just come off of. She stirred when he touched her face. Her eyes opened partway and he saw they were dark brown, almost black in the lantern light, and they looked at him with the desperate, unfocused searching of someone who has ridden as far as they can ride. "Easy," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He had not spoken to another person in 4 days. "You are safe. Do not try to move." Her lips parted. "Is this—" She stopped, swallowed with visible effort. "Is this the Vaughn Ranch?" The sound of his own name from a stranger's mouth startled him considerably. "It is," he said. "Good," she breathed and closed her eyes again. "Then I made it." He wasted no more time on words. He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been for a grown woman, which told him something, and she was hot against his chest even through both their layers of clothing, which told him something more, and none of what it told him was reassuring. He carried her quickly back inside the barn because the barn was closer than the house, and he needed to get her out of the wind immediately. He laid her down on a thick pile of hay he kicked together with one boot, stripped off his own heavy coat and laid it over her, and then set the lantern close enough to give her warmth without any risk. Then he went back out into the snow for the horse. The gray was a good animal underneath the exhaustion, well-built, well-shod, and it came to him without much resistance when he took the reins and led it inside. He unsaddled it and rubbed it down quickly, checked its hooves and legs for damage, and put it in the empty stall next to Copper with a bucket of water and a generous portion of oats. It drank immediately and deeply. He crouched beside the woman again. Her breathing was shallow and too quick, and the heat coming off her skin when he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead made him draw a sharp breath. This was not the beginning of a fever. This was a fever that had been building for days. He studied her for a moment. She was dressed like a woman of some means, but not extravagant means. The coat was well made. The dress beneath it was practical wool, dark green, travel-stained. There was a small leather satchel still buckled to the saddle, and a larger canvas bag tied to the back of the saddle that he had not brought in. He went and got both of them, setting them near her without opening them. He needed to get her into the house and into a warm bed. The barn was sheltered from the wind and significantly warmer than outside, but it was still January in Montana, and hay and a man's coat were not going to be enough to break a fever like this one. He built her as warm a nest as he could manage, layering his coat with 2 horse blankets he pulled from the tack room, and then he went out once more in the screaming dark and crossed the 40 yards to his house to get the fire built high and a bed made ready and water set to boil on the stove. He moved quickly, with the economical efficiency of a man who had lived alone long enough that he wasted no motion. His house was small and spare but solidly built. One main room with the stove and a table and 2 chairs and a shelf of books he rarely touched anymore. A bedroom off the back. A narrow room he used for storage that had once been intended for other purposes. A child's room, maybe, or a hired hand's. But that purpose had never come to pass. He threw 3 large logs into the stove and fanned the coals until the fire caught and roared, then put his largest pot of water on, then went to the bedroom and stripped the bed and remade it with clean sheets he pulled from the chest, and added 2 extra blankets on top. Then he went back to the barn and carried her to the house. She was aware enough to be embarrassed about it, he could tell. She kept trying to tell him she could walk, and he kept not listening to her, because he could feel through the horse blankets that her hands were shaking, and her body had that particular trembling quality of a person running out of reserves. He got her into the bed, boots and outer coat removed, and he had the practical and immediate problem of deciding what to do about the rest of her clothing, which was damp in places from the snow and sweat both. He solved it the only way that made any sense, which was to leave her in as much of it as was dry and pull the blankets up to her chin, and let the warmth of the room and the bed do what they could. He pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside her. "I need to know your name," he said, "and I need to know how long you have been sick." She looked at him from the pillow. Her eyes were clearer now that she was warm and lying down, though still glazed with fever. In the lamplight of the bedroom she was, he noticed it even now, even in the middle of all of it, quite striking. Not in a fashionable way, but in a real and immediate way, the kind of face that did not need anything added to it. "Theresa," she said, "Theresa Reed, I have been sick since." She paused, calculating. "Since Tuesday, I think 3 days. It was Friday. He had a problem on his hands." "How far did you ride today?" "From Harlan's Crossing. I had a room at the boarding house there, but the woman who ran it, Mrs. Conover, she said I could not stay if I was sick. She could not risk it spreading, and I had nowhere else to go." She stopped, breathing carefully. "Someone in town told me there was a ranch a day's ride north. The Vaughn Ranch, they said." She hesitated. "What did they say?" he asked. "They said you were a fair man." She looked at him with those dark eyes. "They said if a person was in real trouble, you would not turn them away." Jedediah sat with that for a moment. He did not know who in Harlan's Crossing had said that about him. He barely went into Harlan's Crossing anymore. "Where were you trying to get to?" he asked. "Before you got sick?" "Miles City," she said. "I came out from Ohio. I had a position arranged, a teaching position at the school there. I was supposed to arrive the 1st of February. "Ohio," he repeated. "My father died in October," she said simply, without self-pity, just stating the facts as they were. "I needed a new situation. The teaching position was the best offer." Jedediah nodded slowly. He thought of practical things. He thought about whether he had the medicines for a fever this bad. He had quinine. He had willow bark. He had some camphor. He had whiskey. He thought about whether she could eat, and whether he had anything worth feeding a sick person, which the answer to that was marginal at best. He thought about whether he should ride for the doctor, and he calculated the distance to Dr. Elias Crane in Harlan's Crossing, which was considerable, and he looked at the snow still driving against the window glass and concluded that riding for the doctor tonight was not possible. He was on his own. "All right, Miss Reed," he said. He stood up. I am going to bring you something for the fever and something to drink. I am going to ask you to try to eat something if you can manage it. I am going to sleep in the chair in the main room. You are going to sleep in this bed for as long as you need to. And tomorrow, if the storm lets up, we will figure out next steps." She looked at him with an expression he could not quite name. Not gratitude exactly, though there was that too. Something more complex, like a person who has been holding on for a very long time and has just been told they can, for a moment, let go. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I am sorry to impose." "You are not imposing," he said, and then he went to the stove and set about making the willow bark tea, and somewhere in the middle of grinding the bark and setting the kettle and cutting a small piece of the hard cheese and dried beef that were the sorry contents of his pantry, he realized that his hands were not entirely steady. He stood still for a moment. He looked at the ceiling. He thought of the last time he had prayed, the specific last time, in a small church in Tennessee in the winter of 1871, with his hands pressed flat on the cold wood of the pew in front of him, and the pastor's voice washing over him, and his world coming apart at the seams. He had prayed then with everything he had, and what had happened anyway. He looked at the ceiling, and at the window, and at the light snow beginning to ease just slightly against the glass. And then, for reasons he could not have adequately explained to another living person, he said under his breath, barely a breath at all, the words of the prayer he had learned as a boy in his mother's kitchen. The words he had not said in 12 years. Not because he had forgotten them, he had never forgotten them, but because he had decided they were hollow. They did not feel hollow now. They felt like something. He was not sure what. He finished making the tea, put the food on a plate, and went back to her. She drank the tea. She managed a few bites of the cheese and could not face the dried beef. He did not push her. He sat with her until her eyes grew heavy, and then he took the empty cup and went back to the main room, stoked the fire, and settled into the better of his 2 chairs with his old wool blanket and his thoughts. Outside, the wind screamed and threw itself against the walls of the house. Inside, he sat in the orange glow of the stove's warmth, and he listened to make sure she was breathing, and he thought about Ohio and teaching positions, and a woman who had ridden a full day through the beginning of a blizzard because a boarding house woman had turned her out in the cold. He thought about that for a long time. He was not an unfeeling man, though he had worked at becoming one. Jedediah Vaughn was 31 years old, which meant he had been born in 1852 in Tennessee, had grown up watching the slow unraveling of everything that family had meant, had come west at 19 with a little money and a great deal of stubbornness, and had spent the intervening years building something that was his. The Vaughn Ranch was not large, but it was real. 800 acres of northern Montana grassland, a solid house, a good barn, a herd of cattle that had been larger before this winter. He had 2 ranch hands who worked for him in the summer and fall able tours, a quiet Mexican man from Texas who was the best hand with cattle Jedediah had ever known, and a young fellow named Kurt Finley who had come out from Missouri 2 seasons ago and had proved more reliable than he looked. But in the deep of winter there was no work that required hands, and both men had gone to spend the cold months in town, which left Jedediah alone. He had not minded the solitude. He had cultivated it. He slept badly in the chair and woke twice to put more wood in the stove and check on her. Both times she was sleeping, but the second time her breathing had changed, grown more labored, and he stood beside the bed in the dark and pressed his hand to her forehead and felt the fever was higher. He was frightened. He recognized the feeling because it was not one he allowed himself often, and its presence now was unambiguous. He went back to the main room and made another cup of willow bark tea and woke her gently to make her drink it, and she woke without confusion, which was a good sign, and drank it without argument, which was also a good sign. Her voice when she thanked him was barely above a whisper. "Is it still snowing?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I am sorry," she said again. "Stop apologizing," he said. It came out harder than he intended. He tried again. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Rest." She looked at him a moment longer. "What is your name? Your first name, I mean. They only told me Vaughn." "Jedediah," he said. "That is a strong name," she said, and closed her eyes. He went back to his chair. By morning the storm had eased to a dull, steady snowfall, the brutal driving wind gone for now. Jedediah was up before any light showed in the sky, had the stove blazing and a pot of actual broth simmering. He had found a ham bone he had been meaning to make soup from and had put it on in the night, and had been out to check the cattle and the horses and had come back red-faced and half-frozen. He looked in on her. She was awake. She looked, he thought, terrible and determined in equal measure. Her color was still wrong, the fever had not broken, but she had pulled herself to sitting against the headboard and was looking around the room with an expression of careful attention, the way a person does when they are trying to memorize their circumstances. "Good morning," he said from the doorway. "Good morning," she said. "What time is it?" "Close to 7. "I need to be up," she said, and started to move the blankets aside. "You need to do no such thing," he said. She looked at him. "I am not an invalid, Mr. Vaughn. I have things, my horse, my bags. Your horse is fed and watered and stands in my barn this morning looking considerably better than you do," he said. "Your bags are in the corner." He nodded toward where he had stacked them. "Lie back down." She studied him. He had the impression she was not a woman accustomed to being told what to do, and that her compliance would be a conscious decision rather than a default. "I could eat," she admitted. "Good," he said. "I have broth." He brought it to her in the room's one bowl, which he wished immediately was finer than it was, though he could not have said exactly why. She ate the broth slowly and carefully, and the color in her face changed slightly, not better exactly, but different, the particular shift that happens when a person's body receives something it needed badly. He sat in the corner chair. "Tell me what to expect," she said, "with the fever." "I am a practical person. I would like to know what we are dealing with." He appreciated that. He told her honestly, the fever would likely peak in the next day or two. She needed to drink as much as she could. The medicines he had were modest but not useless, and if it turned to pneumonia they would need the doctor regardless of the weather. "Have you dealt with fevers before?" she asked. "I ranched the Northern Territories for 12 years, he said. "You deal with whatever comes." "Do you have family nearby?" "No." She accepted this without pushing it. "I will try not to be too much trouble," she said. "You are not trouble," he said, again with that roughness he kept producing when he wanted to sound neutral. "Montana winters are trouble. You are a person." Something in her expression shifted at that, though he was not sure what it was. The second day was the hardest. The fever climbed in the afternoon, and she drifted in and out of a light, restless sleep, talking sometimes in ways that did not quite make sense, referencing people he did not know and places he could not place. He heard the name of her father twice, Harold. She called him Harold Reed, and the second time she said it her face crumpled briefly in her sleep before settling back into stillness. He heard what he thought was the name of a school. He heard once his own name, though he was not entirely certain of that and chose not to examine it too closely. He sat with her. He kept the fire high. He made her drink whatever he could get her to take: broth, water, more willow bark tea, a little honey dissolved in warm water, because he had read somewhere years ago in one of the books on his shelf that honey had properties worth noting in cases of illness. He changed the cloth on her forehead when it grew warm, replacing it with a fresh one wrung out in cool water. He had done this for cattle. He had never done it for a person. It was different in ways he had not anticipated. At some point in the evening she surfaced from the fever sleep with her eyes clear and focused, and found him sitting in the chair reading by the lamp, and she watched him for a long moment before he noticed she was awake. "What are you reading?" she asked. He looked up, closed the book slightly to show her the spine. "Dickens," he said. "Great Expectations." He paused. "I have read it 4 times. What is it about?" She asked, though he suspected she knew, and was asking not for the information but for the company of a conversation. He considered. "A boy who believes the world owes him something because of where he came from," he said, "and the long process of learning that it does not. And that this is not the tragedy he thought it was." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you grow up with money?" No, he said. Not exactly. Comfortable once, then not. The war took most of it. She nodded. She was from Ohio, which meant the war had touched her differently than it had touched him in Tennessee, but she did not probe that, which he was grateful for. My father taught school, she said instead. In a small town called Greenville. I grew up in the schoolroom practically. I used to sit in the back and do my lessons while he taught the older children. I could do arithmetic at 5 because I had heard it so many times. She paused, and the loss moved across her face again, briefly and painfully. He was a very good man. I am sorry, Jedediah said. He meant it entirely. He wanted me to marry, she said, which I know sounds traditional, and perhaps it is, but he did not mean it in the suffocating way. He just wanted me to have someone. He worried at the end about leaving me alone. She seemed to realize she was saying more than she had intended to a stranger and stopped herself. I am sorry. The fever makes me talk. Talk if you want to, he said. I am listening. She looked at him with those dark eyes that even in illness were so alert and perceptive. You live alone here, she said. It was not a question. Yes. By preference or by circumstance. By both, he said, and then, surprising himself, added, though the balance has shifted over the years. She seemed to understand what he meant by that more clearly than he might have expected. She settled back into the pillow. I am going to sleep now, she said. Thank you, Jedediah. His name in her mouth, said naturally, without the formality of Mr. and without any self-consciousness about the use of it, did something odd and unruly to the space behind his sternum. He sat with his book closed in his lap for a long time after she slept. On the third day, the fever broke. He knew it was breaking before she was fully awake, because he had been checking on her through the night, and he felt the change, the heat beginning to let go, the quality of her breathing easing from that strained, effortful rhythm back toward something closer to normal. When she opened her eyes in the gray morning light, she looked exhausted but present in a way she had not been for days, the glaze gone, the focus returned. I am hungry, she said immediately, and it was the most welcome thing anyone had ever said to him. He made her eggs and the last of the cured bacon he had, and toast from the bread he had made 2 days ago, and she ate all of it sitting up in the bed with the tray on her lap, eating with the focused concentration of a person whose body has been demanding fuel and is finally receiving it. He watched her from the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt useful. Not useful in the way a man feels useful when he has fixed a fence or pulled a calf through a difficult birth, though those were real and meaningful things. Useful in a deeper, older way. The way he had almost forgotten was possible. You should eat too, she said, looking up at him. You look like you have not slept. I have slept, he said. In a chair, she said. He said nothing. Jedediah, she set down her fork. Sit down. You have been nursing me through a serious fever for 3 days alone. I imagine there is a great deal of work on a ranch that has not been done. Eat something and tell me what needs doing. He blinked at her. I may not be able to do it yet, she said, but I can listen and think, and that is more than I could do yesterday. She picked up her fork again. Pull up the chair. He pulled up the chair. He ate the second plate of eggs he had made for himself, which he had been planning to eat standing at the stove, and he told her about the 2 cattle he had lost, and the repair needed on the north fence line where a section had given way under snow weight, and about the gelding that needed a shoe replaced when the blacksmith's road was passable again. He told her these things partly because she had asked, and partly because the simple act of speaking about real and practical things to a person who was listening was doing something to the rigid knot of tension he had been carrying in his shoulders since she arrived. She listened carefully and asked specific, sensible questions. She knew nothing about cattle or fencing or horses, she said plainly, but she had a practical mind, and she asked things like whether the remaining cattle were in a sheltered enough location and whether he had anyone he could send for to help with the fence. Abel Torres is in town, he said. My summer hand. He boards with a family there through the winter. If I can get word to him, he might come out. Is the road passable now? Barely, he said. The snow has let up. The temperature has dropped, which is actually easier to ride in than the wet snow, she considered. Could you go today or send someone? There is no one to send, he said, and I am not going to leave you alone. She looked at him steadily. I am better. You are better than you were, he said. You are not well. You are not going to be well for another week at minimum, and I am not going to leave a person who was insensible with fever 48 hours ago alone in the middle of the Montana winter to go to town. He said it firmly, the way he said things when he was not going to be argued with, and then immediately wondered if he had said it the right way. She looked at him for a moment and then, slowly, she smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It was, he catalogued it without meaning to, the way a man catalogues a thing of consequence. It was completely unlike what he would have predicted from the rest of her face. It was warmer, softer. It changed everything about her expression. All right, she said. Then you are stuck with me for a week. I have been stuck with worse, he said, and she laughed briefly before it turned into a cough that was not serious but was a reminder. He got her water and she drank it, and the moment settled into something quiet and easy. He thought, sitting there in his own bedroom in the winter light with the stove throwing warmth through the wall, and this woman he had not known 4 days ago drinking water across from him, that it had been a very long time since anything had felt easy. Over the days that followed, she improved steadily, and the world outside the windows slowly yielded its fury. Jedediah went out daily to tend the cattle and the horses and to do what he could about the fence, and each time he came back she was sitting up more, moving around more, engaged in whatever she had found to occupy herself, which turned out to be his books, read methodically and with real pleasure. She had gone through the Dickens by the 3rd day of her recovery, and had moved on to a battered volume of Emerson's essays, and then to a history of the Western territories that he had bought at a church sale in Harlan's Crossing and never opened. She also, to his genuine surprise, had quietly and without making a point of it cleaned the main room, which had been in a state that he now recognized, through the eyes of her having seen it, as embarrassing. The dishes had been washed and the shelves dusted and the swept floor had actually been swept, not just pushed at. When he came in from a morning with the cattle and found it this way, he stood in the doorway a moment. You should not have done that, he said. You are supposed to be resting. I did it sitting down mostly, she said pleasantly from the chair by the stove where she was reading, and sweeping is not exactly strenuous. Also, she looked up from the book. You had enough dust on those shelves to start a second ranch. He looked at the shelves. They were undeniably much cleaner. Thank you, he said. She went back to reading. He cooked dinner that evening, a proper venison stew, because he had managed to get a deer earlier in the fall and still had a good portion of it in the cold box, and he put in potatoes and the dried herbs he kept in a jar, and she came to the table for it. It was the first time they had eaten a meal together at the table, and it felt different from the meals he had brought her on the tray. It felt like something a person had to choose to do. They ate in comfortable quiet for a while, and then she said, "Tell me about Montana, how you came to be here." So he told her. He told it without the parts he did not tell anyone. Or rather, he started without those parts, but somewhere in the telling, in the warmth of the room and the smell of the stew, and the way she was listening with her chin in her hand and her eyes on his face, he found himself adding pieces he had not planned to add. He told her about coming west from Tennessee at 19 with his brother Marcus. He told her about the years of working other men's cattle, saving every coin, learning the land. He told her about buying the first parcel of this ranch at 23, and Marcus riding with him to see it, 800 acres of grassland that had seemed like the whole world. He told her about Marcus getting work on the railroad and traveling south, and dying in an accident outside of Laramie in the spring of 1874. He had not talked about Marcus to anyone in years. The words came out careful and slow, like something being unwound from a spool. She did not offer platitudes. She said, "I am sorry you lost him," and it was enough. He was 24, Jedediah said. He was supposed to come back in the fall and partner with me on the ranch. We had plans. Do you have anyone else? She asked. Family. My mother, he said, still in Tennessee. She writes, I write back, but she is getting old and she has my aunt with her. And he paused. Distance makes things hard. It does, she said quietly. He looked at her across the table. What about you? No other family? No brothers or sisters? A brother, she said. William. But he married 2 years ago and moved to Indiana with his wife's family. We write. She paused. I think he feels guilty sometimes that he was settled when father died and I was not. But there was nothing to feel guilty about. People make their lives. And your life took you to Ohio one day and then west the next, he said. Ohio was never quite right, she said simply. I always felt like there was something else, something further out. I cannot explain it better than that. She looked past him at the dark window, at the snow that had started again, gentle this time, not the screaming fury of that first night. I love the look of this country. Even sick, coming in on that horse in the dark, I could feel it, the size of it. It gets into a person, he said. If they are built for it. Do you think I am built for it? She asked. She was looking at him directly again, those dark eyes steady and curious. He considered the question seriously. He thought about the woman who had ridden a full day with a climbing fever through the beginning of a blizzard because she had nowhere else to go and no one was going to stop her. He thought about the woman who had eaten eggs with determination the morning her fever broke, as though illness were a practical problem that had been resolved, and it was time to move forward. He thought about the woman who had cleaned his shelves sitting down. Yes, he said, I believe you are. She held his gaze for a moment, and that smile appeared again, the one that changed her face, and he looked down at his bowl and picked up his spoon and could not stop the corner of his own mouth from lifting in response. They were well into the second week of February before she was genuinely strong enough to think about leaving. The road to Miles City was passable. Abel Torres had, in fact, made it out to the ranch after Jedediah had finally ridden to town and back in a single hard day to send word. And Abel had stayed 2 nights, helped fix the fence, and ridden back with the news that the main road south had been broken open by a supply wagon and several riders. Miles City was reachable. Theresa had her teaching position to get to. She was already more than 2 weeks past when she was supposed to arrive, though she had written a letter that Abel had taken to town to be sent by the postal rider, explaining what had happened, asking whether the position was still open. The reply came back after 3 more days. The position was still open. They had understood, the letter said. They would expect her when the weather allowed. She showed him the letter the morning it arrived. He read it and handed it back without saying anything. That evening she asked him to tell her the best route to Miles City, and he spread out the map he kept in the drawer with his papers and showed her, tracing the road with one finger. She stood beside him at the table, close enough that he was acutely aware of the scent of the soap she had found in his washroom and used to wash her hair, a plain Castile soap, nothing fancy, and he focused on the map. 2 days' ride if the weather holds, he said. Maybe 3 if it does not. He paused and then said what he had been thinking for 3 days. I will ride with you. She looked up from the map. You do not have to do that. I am aware, he said. Your cattle. Abel will stay until I am back, he said. He has agreed to it. He had asked Abel before the man had ridden back to town, and Abel had said yes with the contained, private smile he used in place of comment. Theresa was quiet for a moment. Why? She asked. He considered the question, the real question underneath the surface question. He found he was not willing to answer it honestly quite yet. What he said was, the road is not fully safe for a woman alone. There are men coming through in the thaw who are not always decent. It is practical. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him, and he had the uncomfortable and interesting feeling that she was reading him accurately. All right, she said. I accept. She paused. Practically. He looked at the map. He thought his face was probably doing something he would prefer it not to do. They left 2 days later at first light, when the sky was the blue-black of just before dawn and the stars were still sharp and cold overhead. He had packed provisions and they rode side by side on the road that wound south and east through the frozen grassland. The snow was crusted hard enough to hold the horse's weight without breaking through, which made the going easier, and the air was ferociously cold but still. She rode well. He had not been surprised by this. She had made it to his place through much worse conditions, but he found himself watching her handle the gray, which was fractious in the cold morning air, and appreciating the way she managed it. She rode with confidence and without fuss. They stopped midday where a stand of cottonwoods gave some shelter and built a small fire and ate the food he had packed. It was not romantic, particularly cold biscuits and dried apricots and hardtack, and the coffee he made from water he had brought in a canteen, but he thought, watching her drink her coffee without complaining about the temperature of it, that there was something genuine about it. Something that had the flavor of real life rather than pretension. She told him about her mother, who had died when Theresa was 11. She told him about learning to cook and keep house at 11, because there was no one else to do it. She told him about helping her father mark the schoolchildren's papers in the evenings, how she had come to love literature through reading essays aloud to him, because his eyesight had begun to fail in his last years. He told her about the summer he had spent at 20 with a cattle drive heading north from Texas, the heat and the dust and the violence of it, and how he had seen men at their worst under pressure and had learned things about himself he would not have otherwise learned. "What kind of things?" she asked. "That I have a temper I have to manage," he said. "That I am capable of cruelty if I am not careful, and that I do not want to be." She was quiet for a moment. "I think knowing those things about yourself is the harder part of the work," she said. "Most people prefer not to look." "Do you look," he asked, "at myself?" She considered seriously. "I try to. I know I am impatient sometimes. I know I form opinions quickly and then defend them past the point they deserve defending. I know I find it very difficult to ask for help." She paused. "Riding into your yard half dead in a blizzard was the hardest thing I have done in years, and I mean the asking for help part, not the blizzard part." He smiled. He was doing that more often now. He was aware of it. They rode again in the afternoon, and made camp that night at a spot he knew. A sheltered hollow near a creek that was frozen solid but still identifiable by the line of willows along its banks. He built a proper fire and they ate the rest of the provisions, and she fell asleep quickly, wrapped in her blankets, while he sat up and watched the fire and thought. He had been thinking, with increasing inability to stop himself, about what happened when they got to Miles City. She had a position. She had a life to get to. She had come west for a reason, and the reason was the teaching position and the fresh start and the life she was going to build, and none of that had anything to do with him. He had been alone for a long time. He had decided alone was his natural state. He watched the fire and poked at it with a stick and did not sleep well at all. They reached Miles City on the second afternoon. It was a proper town, much larger than Harlan's Crossing, full of the noise and movement and life of a cattle trade hub, with wide muddy streets and long board sidewalks and horses tied at every rail. After the weeks of quiet at the ranch, the noise of it was almost physical. He rode with her to the schoolhouse, which was on the north end of town, a solid new building of unpainted wood with a bell tower that had not yet been given a bell. The schoolmaster, a round, serious man named Mr. Herbert Doane, came out to meet them when he heard the horses. He shook Theresa's hand with genuine relief and welcomed her thoroughly, and then looked at Jedediah with the kind of careful assessing look a man gives a stranger who has ridden in with a woman. "This is Jedediah Vaughn," Theresa said. "He took me in when I was sick. I would not have made it without him." Mr. Doane's expression changed from careful to warm. He shook Jedediah's hand with more feeling than the handshake deserved. "We owe you a great deal, Mr. Vaughn," he said. "Miss Reed's references were extraordinary. We are very glad she arrived safely." Theresa had been found a room with a family named the Hargroves, 2 blocks from the school, a Mrs. Margaret Hargrove, who ran a clean, orderly house and took in boarders with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been doing it for 20 years. Jedediah helped carry Teresa's bags to the room, which was small but well appointed with a proper bed and a window that faced east. She looked around the room with an expression he was learning to read, the careful attention she gave new surroundings, taking inventory of what was real. He stood in the doorway. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. She turned to face him. "I owe you a great deal, Jedediah, you know that." "You owe me nothing," he said. "I owe you my life, probably," she said, quietly and matter-of-factly. "That is not nothing." He was silent for a moment. He looked at her standing in the window light of her new room in her new town with her new life arranged neatly around her, and he thought, "Say it, Vaughn. Say the thing. Be the man who says the thing." But he did not say it. He said instead, "I am glad you are all right. I will ride back tomorrow morning. If you need anything." He stopped. He was standing on the Montana plains, a day's hard ride from his ranch, talking to a woman who had been a stranger 3 weeks ago, and he did not know how to finish that sentence without saying more than he had the right to say. "If you ever come through Harlan's Crossing," he said finally, "or if you need anything." "I know where you are," she said gently. He nodded. He rode out the next morning. He rode north through the cold, and it felt wrong. He had ridden alone his entire life, and it had never felt wrong before, and now it did, which was information he did not want and could not disregard. He went home and worked. He worked with the concentrated fierceness of a man trying to keep his mind from going somewhere it kept wanting to go. He fixed the rest of the north fence. He nursed the cattle through the rest of February with Abel's help. He ordered supplies from town and repaired the barn door and rebuilt the section of the house's back wall where the weather had worked a crack in the mortar. He did all of it properly and completely, and it did not help. He thought about her at inconvenient times. He thought about her reading Emerson in the chair by the stove. He thought about her looking at the map with one strand of dark hair falling loose from its pin at her temple. He thought about her saying his name in the dark when she was sick, and also about her saying it when she was not. He wrote a letter in March. He wrote it 3 times before he wrote a version he was willing to send. The first version said too much. The second version said nothing. The third version said something honest and careful, told her that the cattle were recovering, that the fence was holding, that he had read the rest of the Emerson essays, and that there was one in particular he thought she would like about the nature of self-reliance, and that he hoped she had settled in and found her feet. He sent it. The reply came 3 weeks later, a full 3 weeks, long enough that he had decided it was not coming and had made peace with this, or had been trying to. Her handwriting was clear and unhurried, and very much like her, precise but not stiff, with personality in it. She wrote about the school and the children, 32 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, and about the difficulties of teaching children who had been taught very little before, and the particular joy of watching them understand something for the first time. She wrote about Miles City itself, the strangeness and interest of it, the bustle of the cattle trade, the women she had met at church. She wrote about the Hargroves, who were good people, she said. She wrote, "I read the Emerson essay about self-reliance, and I think I disagree with part of it, and I would like to tell you why, but it is a conversation and not a letter." He read that line 4 times. He wrote back within the week. They wrote through the spring letters that grew in length and frequency as the months passed and spring settled into the Montana grassland, with the slow insistence of life reasserting itself. She told him things about her students. He told her things about the ranch. They disagreed about Emerson in several letters, and the disagreement was the best correspondence he had ever conducted. She was sharp and clear-minded, and she held her positions firmly but without ego, and she was willing to say plainly when he had made a point she had not considered, which he found more attractive than he knew what to do with. He rode into Miles City in May, ostensibly to collect supplies that were too large for the postal rider, which was not entirely untrue but was also not the real reason, and he did not pretend otherwise to himself. He went to the schoolhouse. School was still in session. He had miscalculated, and he stood outside and listened through the open window to her voice, clear and calm and alive with interest, explaining something about geography, asking the children questions, and listening to their answers with what he could hear even from outside was genuine attention. He stood there for a moment longer than he had intended to, and then felt like a fool for standing outside a schoolhouse listening through the window and walked around to the front. When school let out and the children ran past him into the afternoon sunshine, she appeared in the doorway and saw him standing at the fence gate. She stopped. He took his hat off, which was automatic, a reflex of manners that he was glad existed because he could not find a single word. "Jedediah," she said. "I had supplies to collect," he said. She came down the 2 steps from the schoolhouse door and walked toward him across the bare dirt yard, and she was in a gray dress that he had not seen before, with her dark hair pinned up neatly, and she was looking at him with that direct, unguarded look that he had missed with a specificity, and an ache he had tried to tell himself was something else. "I am glad you came," she said. "I am glad to see you," he said. He was making none of the speeches he had composed and discarded over the spring. He was saying nothing that was anywhere near adequate. He was standing in the sunshine in Miles City, Montana, hat in hand, and looking at Theresa Reed as though she were something he had been looking for without knowing the name of it. "Come and have supper," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove will not mind. Come and tell me how copper is and what the pasture looks like and whether the fence held." "The fence held," he said. "Come and tell me anyway," she said, and there was that smile. He had supper with her and the Hargroves, who were a decent family. Mr. Hargrove was a leather goods merchant with a quiet manner and a dry wit, and Mrs. Hargrove was warm and observant, and clearly doing considerable calculating about the man who had arrived from the north to have supper. And after supper Theresa and Jedediah sat on the front porch in the last of the evening light, which lingered long in the Montana spring, and talked until the dark came and the stars came out. He told her things he had not told anyone. He told her about Tennessee and about the specific weight of the years after the war on his family, the reduced circumstances and his father's loss of hope, and the particular helplessness of being a boy watching a man he loved diminish. He told her about Marcus. He told her about why he had stopped praying, the specific event, his brother's death, and the months after when he had prayed and asked and received nothing and finally, one evening in an empty church, had stood up and walked out and not walked back in. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned toward him in the dark. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Stopping?" "The night you arrived," he said slowly, "I stood in my kitchen making willow bark tea and I said a prayer. I had not said one in 12 years and every word was still there, all of it, like it had been waiting." He paused. "I do not know what to do with that." "Maybe it does not have to be done with," she said. "Maybe it just is." He was quiet for a moment. "I was scared that night," he said. "When I felt how high the fever was, I was more frightened than I had been in a long time." "For me?" she said quietly. "Yes," he said. The words sat between them in the dark, honest and complete. She reached over and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. Her hand was warm and steady and she left it there, not moving it, not making it into anything more than what it was, the simple human contact of one person telling another that they have heard them. He looked at her hand on his. He turned his hand over slowly and held hers. They sat like that in the dark and did not say anything else for a while, and the silence was the best conversation he had ever had. He rode home the next morning. He did not say the things that were fully and completely ready to be said, because he recognized this about himself even as it was happening, a man who moved slowly when it mattered, who needed to be sure, who had been surprised before by things he thought he understood, and had taken the lesson too hard, perhaps, but had taken it nonetheless. But he rode home with her hand still warm in the memory of his, and he thought about the spring and the summer and the fall, and he began to plan with the careful, practical determination that was the most characteristic thing about him. In June he wrote and asked her if she would like to ride with him on a Sunday, if she had Sundays free. There was a stretch of river valley 20 miles north of Miles City that he thought she would like to see, the grassland opening into a valley with a river running through it and a stand of old cottonwoods along the bank. She wrote back that she would like that very much, and that she had Sundays free. He came for her the following Sunday with Copper, and with a bay mare he had borrowed from a man he knew in the outlying area, whose horses were known to be good-tempered, and they rode north into the grassland under a sky that was simply enormous, the kind of Montana sky that made a person understand why people came west. They rode out to the river valley, and he watched her face when it came into view, the land opening suddenly, dropping down, the river silver blue in the morning light, the cottonwoods beginning to show their summer green, and beyond everything the mountains, still capped with snow, holding the horizon. She pulled the bay mare to a stop and just looked. "Good Lord," she said quietly. "I thought you would like it," he said. "I have never seen anything like this in my life." She paused. "I spent 23 years in Ohio, and I never once saw anything that looked like this." They dismounted and let the horses graze and walked down to the river, where the water was cold and quick and clear enough to see the stones on the bottom. She crouched down and put her fingers in it and drew them back quickly with a small sound of shock at the temperature, and then laughed, and the laugh echoed off the cottonwood leaves and the water and the wide sky. He stood beside her and watched her laugh and thought, "Now, say it now." "Theresa," he said. She looked up at him from her crouch beside the water. "I would like you to consider something," he said. He had practiced this, but the practiced version was not going to come out the way he had practiced it, he could already tell. "I would like you to consider whether, at some point, you might want to, whether there is any possibility that you—" She stood up. "Jedediah," she said. He stopped. "Are you trying to tell me something?" she asked. Her voice was even, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "Yes," he said. "I am doing it very poorly." She was quiet for a moment. The river ran past them and the cottonwood leaves moved in the warm breeze. "In one of your letters," she said, "the one in April where you told me about the calf you pulled through by yourself in the middle of the night, you ended it by saying that you had been thinking about the winter and that you found yourself hoping the winter would be repeated under better circumstances. Do you remember writing that?" "Yes," he said. "I read that letter 5 times," she said simply, "the night I received it. And then I folded it very carefully and put it in the inner pocket of my satchel, where I keep the things I do not want to lose." He looked at her. "You do not have to practice speeches with me," she said gently and with such directness that it struck him like clear water. "You can just say the thing." "I love you," he said. He had not said those words to anyone in 12 years. They sounded different than he remembered. They sounded like something true. She stepped toward him, closed the small distance, and took his face in both her hands, which were still cold from the river. And he laughed slightly at the cold, and then she kissed him, and the cottonwoods moved, and the river ran, and the sky went on forever overhead. He kissed her back with everything that had been building since January, since the night she had collapsed in the snow in his yard, and he had dropped his pitchfork and run. And it was like the prayer in the kitchen, like the words he had thought were hollow returning and not being hollow at all, like something that had been stored in him waiting for the moment it was needed. They pulled back and she was looking at him with shining eyes and the smile that changed everything. "I love you too," she said. If that was not completely obvious. "It was not completely obvious," he said. "I thought it might be hopeful thinking." "Jedediah Vaughn," she said, "I folded that letter into my inner pocket. I'm not a woman who folds letters into her inner pocket for hopeful thinking." He laughed, a real laugh, full and uncomplicated, and she laughed too, and then he pulled her into his arms and she came without any hesitation, and they stood there beside the river with the summer all around them and no urgency and nowhere else they needed to be. He proposed to her in August. He did it properly, at the river valley, because it felt like the right place, and he had a ring that had been his mother's. A simple gold band with a small garnet that his mother had written and told him to use when the time was right, the letter arriving almost as though she had known somehow, which he would not have put past her. and Theresa said yes before he had fully finished asking, which made him feel simultaneously embarrassed at his own slow sentence and deeply happy. They were married in October, in the small church in Harlan's Crossing, which was the closest church to the ranch, on a Saturday when the aspens had gone gold and the sky was the profound blue of the high country fall. Mr. Doane attended. Abel Torres attended, wearing his best clothes and looking quietly pleased. The Hargroves made the trip, a handful of ranching families from the area who Jedediah knew in the way of men who share fences and occasional help, came with their wives and children. Theresa wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself over the summer months, simple and well-made, and she walked up the aisle with her chin up and her dark eyes steady, and her smile, the one that changed everything, turned on him the entire way. He had found a small church again for the first time in 12 years. He stood at the front of it and watched her come toward him and thought that prayers, it turned out, were answered in ways that made no sense on the face of it. Not in the manner of requests granted, which had been the framework he had abandoned, but in the manner of a door opening that you had not known was there. She had come through his door in a blizzard, half dead on her feet, and she had opened something he had thought permanently sealed. The minister, a young, earnest man named Pastor Fields who had been in Harlan's Crossing only 18 months, read from Corinthians, and Jedediah listened with the full attention of a man who has walked around something for a long time and has finally come back to stand in front of it. They rode back to the ranch that evening together, Theresa on the gray and Jedediah on copper, side by side on the road north as the stars came out, and the cold air carried the particular clarity of autumn. She was wearing his coat over her wedding dress because the evening had turned sharp, and she was talking about the ranch and what she wanted to do with the kitchen garden in the spring, and he was listening and occasionally interjecting and thinking that this was the best ride of his life, and that he intended to remember everything about it. She came to the ranch, and she made it hers without erasing anything of his. She hung a length of blue calico fabric at the window of the main room, not curtains exactly, just a softening of the light. She put her books on the shelf alongside his, and their spines made a kind of conversation. She planted the kitchen garden in the spring, an ambitious enterprise involving potatoes and beans and the herbs she had identified could survive the season, and a brief attempt at tomatoes which the weather ultimately declined to support, which she reported with philosophical equanimity. She kept teaching. The miles between the ranch and Miles City were considerable, but they arranged it together. She stayed with the Hargroves during the weeks and came home on weekends when the weather allowed, and he rode in when he could, and it was not an arrangement that suited either of them entirely, but it suited them practically, and they were practical people. This arrangement ended before the following winter for a reason that required them to be practical in a new direction. She knew before he did and told him on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, simply and directly, without dramatics, which was entirely characteristic. He stood very still for a moment. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am certain," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in his hands and looked at her, this woman who had collapsed in his yard in the snow and changed everything, and he could not find a single adequate thing to say. "Jedediah," she said, reading his expression, "it is good news." "I know," he said. "I know it is." He pressed his forehead against hers. "I just need a moment." "Take your moment," she said gently. He wrote to his mother that week. He wrote about Theresa, everything he should have written months ago, and about the baby coming, and he sent the letter, and his mother's reply arrived 6 weeks later, written in her familiar careful hand, and contained within it a frankly expressed opinion that it was about time, and also a lengthy set of instructions regarding the proper care of a woman in the months of expectancy, approximately half of which was useful, and the remainder of which reflected conditions specific to Tennessee and the 1850s that were not directly applicable, but were touching in their intent. Theresa's letter to her brother William produced a response that came with a warmth that surprised her and that she read him aloud at the table, and when she finished, she set the letter down and sat quietly for a moment in the way she sometimes did when she was absorbing something important. "He is glad," she said. "He sounds genuinely glad. Did you doubt he would be? We have grown careful with each other," she said. "Since father, I did not know what we still had." She folded the letter neatly. "This helps me know." He had written to Abel Torres in January and asked him to come earlier than usual that spring, explaining why without extensive elaboration, and Abel had arrived in March with his quiet manner and a gift of a beautifully crafted small blanket that his wife in Texas had made and sent with him when he had told her the news. Jedediah had not known Abel had a wife in Texas. He asked about her that evening, and Abel talked about her with an unguarded warmth that was wholly unlike his usual economy of expression. And they sat together that night and drank coffee and talked about their women, and it was the best conversation Jedediah had ever had with another man. The baby came in July. The labor was long, and Jedediah spent the better portion of 16 hours ranging between the bedroom where Theresa and the midwife, a competent and iron-nerved woman named Mrs. Breck from Harlan's Crossing, were conducting matters, and the porch, where he stood and looked at the summer grassland and breathed and tried to behave like a person in command of himself. Abel found him on the porch at one point and handed him a cup of coffee without a word, and stood beside him in companionable silence, which was the most helpful thing anyone could have done. The baby was a boy. Jedediah held him in the lamplight of the bedroom while Theresa, exhausted and entirely herself, watched him with the particular look that was new on her face, and yet somehow not surprising at all, the look of a woman who has added a new and enormous love to the collection she carries. "He looks like you," she said. The baby was red-faced and blinking, and he thought, looked somewhat like everyone and no one in particular, but he was not going to argue. "What do we name him?" he asked. He had not pushed on this. They had discussed names generally but left it open. She was quiet for a moment. "I would like to name him Marcus," she said. "If that is all right." He looked at her. He had told her about Marcus, his brother, who had died at 24, who had been supposed to be his partner. He looked at her and he could not speak for a moment. "Yes," he said when he could. "That is right. Marcus Vaughn entered the world in July 1884 and immediately set about demonstrating the will of a person who knows what he wants and the lungs to communicate it, which his mother found amusing and his father found both exhausting and deeply gratifying. He was a strong baby, and then a strong toddler, and then a small, determined person who wanted to be outside and near the horses from approximately the moment he could walk, which Abel said was the most promising sign he had ever seen, and which Theresa said was going to be the death of them both. Jedediah taught school to Marcus in the evenings. Theresa had stopped teaching at the Miles City School after Marcus was born. They had agreed together that the arrangement of separate weeks could not continue, and she had resigned her position with Mr. Doan's considerable regret, and the schoolchildren's expressed displeasure. But she missed the teaching, and it showed, and so the evenings became school time with Marcus as the student, and sometimes Abel, who had taught himself to read in English but whose reading was slow, and who, when offered, accepted the teaching with quiet dignity. Theresa wrote to Mr. Doan in the spring of 1885 with a proposal that she conduct a small school on the ranch for the children of the outlying farms and ranches in the area, several of whom had no other access to education, the nearest school being too far for regular attendance. She organized it herself with the precision and initiative that characterized everything she did, and Jedediah built her a schoolroom onto the back of the house, a proper room, with good windows for the light she said children needed, and a proper blackboard he commissioned from Miles City, which arrived on a freight wagon and which he installed himself, and which she ran her hand over when it was done as though he had given her something extraordinary. She had 6 students to begin with. By the following year she had 11. By 1887 She had 17, ranging from 5 to 14, and the schoolroom had been expanded once, and the territory had taken a formal interest in what she was doing, the local education board sending a representative out who had gone away apparently impressed, because a small stipend had been arranged for her services. This was also the year their daughter was born, Grace, who arrived in February with a full head of dark hair exactly like her mother's and an alert, interested expression that suggested she would be watching everything very carefully, which proved accurate. Marcus, who was 3 by then, received his sister with the suspicious reserve of a child who has not been consulted, and then, within 2 days, with the fierceness of one who has decided the arrangement is acceptable and any threat to it would be answered. The ranch grew. Jedediah bought the additional 300 acres to the north that had come available when the Pelly family moved south to warmer territory, and he and Abel expanded the herd. And by the late 1880s, the Vaughn Ranch was not merely surviving but prospering in the slow, steady, unglamorous way that real prosperity comes on the northern plains. They had a full-time hired man by this point, in addition to Abel, a young man named Thomas Briggs from Iowa who had come west with nothing but a good back and a willingness to learn, and who had proved both honest and capable. Jedediah had found his way back to church. Not with the compulsive regularity of performance, not with the stiff social function it could sometimes become, but with something that felt genuine. A monthly ride to Harlan's Crossing with Theresa, sometimes with Marcus on the saddle in front of him, later with Grace on hers, and the sitting in the simple whitewashed church, and the listening and the thinking and the occasional prayer said not as a demand but as a conversation. He told Theresa once that he was not sure he understood God any better than he had before, but that he was less interested in understanding and more interested in being the kind of man who showed up. She had looked at him over the children's heads with that expression she had, affectionate and perceptive and entirely without sentimentality, and said, "I think that might be exactly right." In the spring of 1889, Montana entered the Union as a state. There was a celebration in Harlan's Crossing with speeches and music and a great deal of food, and Jedediah and Theresa went with their children and Abel and Thomas Briggs, and stood in the main street with the rest of the gathered community, while a man with a fine voice read the proclamation aloud. Marcus, who was 5, wanted to know what a state was and why it was different from a territory, and Theresa began explaining with the thoroughness of a teacher, and Grace, who was 2, fell asleep against Jedediah's shoulder in the afternoon sun, and he stood there in the Montana sunshine with a sleeping daughter on his shoulder and his wife's clear voice in his ear explaining American governance to his son, and thought about January 1883, about the sound of a body meeting frozen earth, about a woman's dark eyes opening and finding his in the lantern light and asking if this was the Vaughn Ranch. He thought, yes, it is, and it turned out that was the beginning of everything. His mother finally made the journey west in the fall of 1889, which Jedediah had not believed she would do, and which she accomplished with the determined competence of a woman who had made up her mind. She was 63 and had a slight stoop from arthritis, but her eyes were sharp, and her opinions were sharper, and she arrived on the stage into Harlan's Crossing with one large trunk and 2 smaller bags, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting to see something for too long and is now going to see it. She took one look at Theresa and then embraced her with a warmth and completeness that made Theresa's eyes bright, and that Jedediah watched from the side with the complicated feeling of a person watching 2 beloved things become known to each other. His mother looked around the ranch. She looked at the house and the barn and the kitchen garden and the schoolroom. She looked at the herd from the porch railing. She looked at Marcus and then crouched down slowly with the care her arthritis required and studied him, and he looked back with the gravity of 5-year-old who is aware something important is happening. "You look just like your father did," she said. "At your age, the same eyes." "I am going to be a rancher," Marcus told her seriously, "and I am also going to know mathematics." "That is an excellent plan," she said. She looked up from Marcus to Jedediah and said nothing, but her face said everything. It said, "Yes. This is what I wanted for you. This is what I prayed for when you stopped praying." He helped her up from her crouch and she patted his arm once firmly, which was as close to a declaration as she generally came. And then Theresa came up beside him and took his mother's other arm and walked with her toward the house, talking, already on their way to knowing each other. He stood in the yard in the fall sunshine and watched them go. He thought about a night in January, about snow so thick you could not see your own hand, about the sound of a pitchfork dropped, about carrying a woman through the dark and the cold and being frightened in a way he had not felt in years, and about standing in his kitchen afterward saying old words into the empty room. He had not prayed in 12 years. The night she arrived sick in the snow, he had remembered every word. And the answer had been all of this. The ranch and the children and the woman and the mother walking toward his house in the autumn light, and the full, unglamorous, difficult, beautiful weight of a life he had not known he was building until it was built. The years continued to layer themselves, each one different and the same. The seasons turned with the reliable drama of the Montana landscape, springs that arrived late and hit hard, summers of grassland heat and the particular piece of long light, falls that smelled of hay and frost and wood smoke, winters that demanded everything and gave back silence and stars. Jedediah's mother stayed through the winter and then stayed through the spring, and then quietly extended her stay through the following fall in the way of a woman who has found the place she most wants to be and sees no compelling reason to leave it. Her arthritis improved in the dry mountain air, or so she said. Theresa maintained a deep and genuine affection for her, and the two women had an alliance that occasionally left Jedediah feeling very slightly outnumbered, which he found he did not mind at all. By 1890, the schoolroom had expanded a third time, and Theresa had taken on an assistant, a young woman from Harlan's Crossing, barely 18, named Dorothy Hale, who had shown natural ability with children and a passion for learning, and whom Theresa was training with the systematic intention of a woman who plans for what she is building to outlast her. Dorothy came out 3 days a week and sat in the lessons and helped with the younger children and left in the evenings on her horse with books tucked under her arm. "You are training your own replacement," Jedediah observed one evening. "I am building something larger than one person," Theresa said, which was such a typically Theresa thing to say that he kissed her forehead and went back to his reading. Marcus at 6 could read better than most children twice his age, which was inevitable given his circumstances, and had a mechanical intelligence that expressed itself in an intense interest in how things were built and fixed. He spent hours in the barn watching Jedediah repair equipment, asking questions with the relentlessness of a child who genuinely wants to know, and Jedediah answered all of them with the patience he brought to things that mattered. He and Abel were teaching Marcus to ride with real attention to technique, and the boy took to it with the natural ease that occasionally manifested in people who were simply made for it. Grace at 3 was a different kind of person entirely. Where Marcus was focused outward, interested in the world's workings, Grace was observant in a quieter, more internal way. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she often said things that surprised the adults around her with their precision. She had her mother's dark eyes and something in her expression that Jedediah sometimes caught at unexpected moments, a look of considered assessment that was startlingly like her mother at her most perceptive, that stopped him in his tracks every time. In the summer of 1891, Abel Torres brought news. He had been riding back from Harlan's Crossing with supplies when he had stopped at the Pelly Ranch, the property Jedediah had purchased to the north, which was now part of the Vaughn holding but had a sound house on it that stood empty. He had passed a family camped at the edge of the property, A man and a woman and 3 small children who were moving through and had lost a wagon wheel and had nowhere to camp properly. He had told them to make use of the barn at the empty house for the night. Jedediah rode out to see. The family were decent people. A man named Frank Alderman and his wife Clara, from Minnesota, heading farther west in search of land. Frank was a skilled carpenter, it became apparent, who had worked the building trades in the East before deciding he wanted land of his own. Their situation was precarious. The wagon needed real work, not just a wheel, and the baby of the 3 children was showing signs of illness. Theresa came out the following morning. She looked at the baby and called for water and clean cloths, and took over with the brisk, competent decisiveness she brought to people who needed help. And Jedediah watched her, his wife, surrounded by strangers in a cold field, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, talking to Clara Alderman with the direct warmth of a person who has no patience for unnecessary distance between human beings, and felt something he felt consistently and without diminishment. Something that had not lessened in 8 years of marriage but had, if anything, deepened into the kind of feeling that was less like fire and more like the river, constant and cold and clear. He helped Frank repair the wagon. It took 3 days. During those 3 days the families ate together, and the Alderman children, who were 4 and 6 and the baby at 14 months, were absorbed into the household with the natural flexibility of children who have been moving and adapting. Marcus found the older Alderman boy irresistible, and they disappeared together into the barn for most of the daylight hours to the satisfaction of both mothers. The baby recovered. The wagon was repaired. Frank and Clara Alderman stood in the yard on the 4th morning with their children around them and their wagon loaded, and Frank shook Jedediah's hand and said that if there was ever anything he could do, any work, any trade, he was in their debt. Theresa had been thinking about this. She pulled Jedediah aside the night before. "The empty house," she said. He looked at her. "We are not using it," she said, "and we need a proper school building, not just the room on the house. And Frank Alderman is a carpenter who needs land and work." She paused. "I am not telling you what to do with your property. I am telling you what I am thinking." He had already been thinking most of the same things, which was, he reflected, one of the great and daily pleasures of being married to this particular woman. He went and talked to Frank Alderman that evening, and they came to an arrangement. Frank and his family would take the empty house at the north of the property. Frank would work for the ranch part of the week and use the rest to work his own small plot. And in exchange for a reduction in rent, he would build Theresa her school building. He and Clara were given a portion of the land to farm, and the arrangement took hold with the permanence of something that was the right shape for where it was placed. The school building went up in the fall of 1891, a proper structure, well built, with good flooring and 3 windows on the south side for light and a stove in the corner, and a small bell tower that Frank Alderman topped off with a real bell, the purchase of which Theresa organized through a subscription from the families of the schoolchildren. The day they hung the bell and rang it, the sound carried across the grassland clear and bright, and Jedediah stood in the yard and listened to it ring, and thought of the schoolhouse in Miles City with the bell tower and no bell. The day he had ridden in with her and stood at the gate and could not find a single adequate word. They had come a long way from that gate. His mother was the one who pointed out, one evening in December of that year, that he looked like a man who had had everything he was supposed to have and knew it. She said it plainly because she was a plain woman, and then went back to her mending. He sat with it for a while. He thought about 12 years of praying nothing. He thought about one prayer in a kitchen at midnight in January, snow against the windows and a stranger dying in his bedroom, and the words coming back full and exact as though they had been kept somewhere safe. He thought about all the ways the answer had not looked like an answer at first, had looked like trouble, like a burden, like a sick woman and a storm and no resources, and a body too light for its age. He thought about how the best things in his life had arrived looking, at first, like emergency. He went to church that Sunday and sat in the simple whitewashed building with Marcus pressed against his side and Grace on Theresa's lap. And he listened to Pastor Fields, who had grown from earnest to capable over the years, and he said a prayer that was not a demand or a request or even exactly a thanksgiving, but was something closer to a recognition. The acknowledgement of a man who had been wrong about several important things and had been given the grace to find out. By 1893, the children were 7 and 4, and the ranch was one of the established operations of the northern Montana Territory, and Theresa's school had a reputation that had spread far enough that the Territorial Education Board had made it the model for several other rural school arrangements in the area. Dorothy Hale was running 3 of the weekly school days independently now, and the student count had reached 22. There was a letter that year from William Reed, Theresa's brother in Indiana, saying that he and his wife were expecting their first child and asking, with a tentativeness that told its own story about how careful they had grown with each other, whether there was any possibility Theresa might come east for the occasion. He meant well, and he wanted connection, and the asking was itself a kind of bridge building. Theresa talked about it with Jedediah at the table one evening. She was quieter than usual. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I want both things," she said. "I want to see William and I do not want to leave." She paused. "Is that ungrateful of me?" "No," he said. "It means you have built something worth staying for." She looked at him. "We have built something worth staying for," she said. He wrote to William Reed himself a letter proposing an alternative, which was that William and his wife might consider the journey west for a summer visit, when the ranch was at its best and the country was at its most dramatic, and that they were welcome for as long as they wished. The letter was careful and genuine, and included a description of what they had built here that he had not initially planned to write but found himself writing, because he wanted William Reed to understand what his sister had made of her life. William came in the summer of 1894 with his wife Eleanor and their new son, James, who was 8 months, and a robust child of determined character. The visit lasted 3 weeks, and by the end of it, the careful distance between Theresa and her brother had been thoroughly demolished by proximity and shared meals and long rides and evening conversations on the porch, and William Reed, standing beside the fence on his last morning and looking at the vista of the Vaughn ranch in the summer light, told his sister that their father would have loved this. She nodded. She took his hand for a moment briefly, and then let it go. "He worried about leaving me alone," she said. "Do you remember?" At the end. "I remember," William said. "I hope he knew," she said, "somehow, that I found this." Jedediah was standing a few feet away, and he did not think he was meant to hear this, but he heard it, and he filed it away in the place he kept the things that mattered most. The summer was long and golden. Marcus turned 10 and could already do more of the ranch work than most boys twice his age, and Jedediah began to teach him the accounts and the land management in earnest, because the ranch would be his one day, and he should grow into it understanding every part. Grace turned 7 and showed an intellectual voraciousness that was already pushing at what Dorothy Hale could offer her, and that Theresa was meeting with books ordered from as far away as Chicago. In the fall of 1894, Theresa told him she was expecting again. Their third. He had learned by now not to be struck still by this news. He received it the way he received good things that were also serious things, with quiet, full attention and the careful setting aside of other concerns. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Well," she said, "better than the first 2 times at this stage." "Good," he said. He pulled her close and held her in the kitchen where they were standing, which was as different as it was possible to be from another kitchen in another winter, and yet it contained that other kitchen somehow, the way that all of what they were now contained what they had been at the beginning. The baby arrived in June 1895, another boy, who came into the world with considerably less drama than his siblings and looked around the room with the patient and interested expression of someone who plans to stay a while and is getting his bearings. They named him Harold for her father. Harold Reed Vaughn. She had proposed it and he had agreed immediately, and when he told her she could not stop smiling, not for the rest of the day. Marcus at 11 received his new brother with the authority of seniority and immediately began explaining the ranch to him, which the 3-week-old Harold was unable to appreciate, but which Marcus conducted with great thoroughness regardless. Grace mothered Harold with a competence that was startling in a 7-year-old, and that made Theresa observe, privately to Jedediah, that they had accidentally produced a third child who was going to be a teacher. The ranch moved through its seasons. The cattle market had its years of plenty and its harder years, but the Vaughn operation had diversified enough and was established enough to absorb the hard years without catastrophe. The Aldermans had become neighbors and friends. Frank's carpentry skills employed on several further improvements to the property, and his wife, Clara, a reliable presence at the school as a volunteer. Abel Torres had married a woman named Rosa, whom he had brought back from a trip to Texas in the winter of 1892. A quiet, observant person who had made herself immediately essential to the community in the way of someone who sees exactly what needs doing and does it. Thomas Briggs had married Dorothy Hale in 1893, which no one had explicitly expected and everyone had privately seen coming, and they had a small house in Harlan's Crossing, and Thomas continued as ranch hand through the working seasons while Dorothy continued her work with the school. In the winter of 1896, Jedediah's mother passed quietly in her sleep, in the room at the back of the house that had become hers, in the house she had stayed in and not left after that first winter. She was 69, and her health had been declining for 2 years with the steadiness of a season changing, and she was not alone, and she was in the place she had most wanted to be. Theresa sat with Jedediah in the kitchen after in the early hours when the house was still, and did not try to fill the silence but simply stayed in it with him, her hand in his on the table, as she had been willing to do from the beginning. He missed his mother. He would miss her for the rest of his life. But grief, he had learned, was the accounting of love, the measure of what had been real, and therefore worth the measure. He said a prayer for her. He said it in the kitchen where he had said the first prayer in 12 years, 13 years before. He was a man who prayed again. Imperfectly and without certainty, and with the honest ambivalence of someone who has lost and found and lost again, but consistently, with the presence of a man who has decided to show up. In the spring of 1897, Marcus turned 13, and Jedediah began taking him on the longer rides, showing him the full scope of the land, the boundaries and the water rights and the seasonal patterns of the herd, the things that could only be learned by being out in it. They rode together in the early mornings when the mist was still on the grassland and the mountains caught the first light, and the boy was good company, a good listener and an asker of real questions, and in him Jedediah saw the particular pleasure of watching someone become themselves. Grace turned 10 and had read more books than most adults in the territory and was already writing stories, essays, observations in a notebook she kept under her mattress, which Jedediah knew about and had never mentioned. Harold turned 2 and was beginning to talk in earnest, long, breathless strings of discovery, pointing at everything and demanding its name. One evening in April of that year, Theresa and Jedediah rode out together after supper, just the two of them, which was a thing they managed occasionally when the children were old enough to manage short periods without them. They rode north to the part of the property that extended up into a long, gradual rise, where the grassland gave way to the first approach of the tree line, and they went slowly in the long spring twilight. They dismounted and let the horses graze and stood at the edge of the rise, looking out over the full expanse of the Vaughn Ranch, the house with its light in the windows, the barn, the school building with its bell tower, the fields and the fences and the cattle moving slowly in the last of the light, and beyond all of it the endless distance of the Montana plains rolling toward mountains that were pink with the setting sun. He stood beside her. After a while he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they stood there in the quiet which was not quite silent. The horses grazed nearby. The breeze moved through the grass. Somewhere a meadowlark said its piece. "Do you remember," she said, "you told me about the first time you saw this land when you brought Marcus to see it?" Yes, he said. He had told her that in the early months one evening. He could not remember any more whether it had been in a letter or in person. "I think I understand it now," she said. "The feeling of standing on something that is yours." "It is ours," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what I mean." They stood in the last of the light, and the stars began to come out overhead the way they did on the high plains. Gradually, and then all at once, the whole canopy of them, more stars than any one person could ever count. He thought about a night in January when the snow had come in so fast and thick that a man could not see his hand in front of his face, and a woman had collapsed in his yard and he had run to her without thinking about it. He thought about how, in the years since, he had thought about that night many times, and each time the memory had a slightly different quality, had been frightening, then humbling, then grateful, then something that had settled into the simple, bedrock fact of origin. The beginning point. The first line, the night she arrived sick in the snow. He had carried her in out of the cold and sat beside her and done what he could and been afraid and prayed, and none of it had been wasted. Not the fear, not the prayer, not the sitting through the long dark nights. All of it had been in the way of things that matter, exactly necessary. "Theresa," he said. "Yes," she said, without moving from where she was leaned against him. "I love you," he said, the way he said it in the beginning. The way he had kept on saying it, because it remained true with the same force as the first time he had said it beside the river, which was the force of something discovered after a long time of looking. She turned her head and looked up at him in the gathering dark. Her face in the starlight was the face he had been watching for 14 years, the face he had studied when she was sick and frightened, and when she was laughing, and when she was intent on her books, and when she was asleep, and when she was looking at their children with the love that had no adequate language, the face that had changed everything by arriving. "I love you," she said. "Still. More." He kissed her in the dark on the rise above their ranch, with the stars coming out overhead and the horses grazing nearby. And it was exactly as it had always been, steady and true and made of real things. They rode home in the starlight, side by side, back to the lit windows and the children and the life they had built from a snowstorm and a prayer and two people willing to be found. The bell on the school building had a sound that carried on clear mornings all the way to the north fence line, and in the years that followed, when Jedediah was riding the property in the early hours and he heard it ring, Grace ringing it, eventually, because she had taken over as the school's second teacher at 17 and never quite given it up, he would stop what he was doing and listen to it carry across the grassland. He had not prayed in 12 years. The night she arrived sick in the snow, he had remembered every word, and the answer had rung out across the Montana morning like a bell, clear and far-carrying, and made to be heard by anyone paying attention. He had been paying attention. He still was.